I lived with my stepmother after my father died. She was 43. I was 20. One day, I found a box of condoms and a cucumber next to my stepmother's bed. I did something that shocked her. Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm 20, a sophomore psychology major. I didn't plan on staying long after the funeral, but I did. Linda, my stepmother, didn't ask. She didn't tell me to go. The small town we lived in was Dayton, Ohio. People say everyone here knows everyone else's business, but that's not entirely true. They don't know. They just like to guess. Linda, my stepmother, was the only woman my father ever loved after my mother died. She didn't replace my mother. She didn't try to be anything I didn't need. She just was there. In the days after the funeral, the house felt larger than usual. Not because someone had just left, but because everything that had filled the air, voices the radio playing in the morning, unfinished conversations at the dinner table, had disappeared with the person who had died. Linda and I were like two shadows that briefly touched in the hallway and the kitchen on the stairs, then separated each of us in our own world. Linda didn't wear black forever, but she never went back to wearing floral dresses or high heels. I still took hot baths in the evenings as I had done since living with my father, but I no longer hummed any songs in the bathroom. There were little things that no one noticed, like the sound of her pulling up a chair every night at 7 o'clock, even when no one was sitting across from me, or the fact that I left a bottle of wine in the kitchen, even though I never drank. We didn't talk about the pain, just lived around it. It was like walking past a room with too much light no one wanted to enter. One evening, as the first snow of the season fell like silk on the windowsill, I saw Linda standing in front of the refrigerator, staring at a bottle of water for almost a minute. She didn't open the refrigerator. Nothing. Just standing there as if waiting for someone to make a decision for me. I didn't ask her what she was thinking. I just poured another glass of water and put it by the sink. The next morning, the glass was clean. Maybe we don't need words, just someone to see us without judgment. I didn't tell my friends at college that I was living with my stepmother. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want them to start any questions with why. I drove to school 3 times a week. I came home late at night. Linda never asked, "What did you study today? Did you take your test? How did you do?" But I always found an extra portion of rice in the refrigerator, carefully wrapped, usually my favorite. I never asked, "Did you sleep well? Are you okay? Has anyone called?" But I kept cold medicine on hand, a few new novels on the shelf, and sometimes just left a little note that said, "The heater downstairs is noisy. I fixed it." That's how we lived. No names, no definitions. But we didn't let go. I remember Linda opening the closet, then closing it right back. Inside, my dad's gray suit was still hanging neatly. The hanger next to it was empty. I wanted to ask her, "Why don't you put it away?" But I thought maybe she wasn't ready or never would be. One night, the hallway light burned out. I changed the bulb. As I stood on the chair, Linda came out of the bedroom. She paused, said nothing. We stood looking at each other in the new light, clearer, whiter, colder. For a moment, she said only, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome." For the first time in months, her voice was not hoarse. I did not avoid her eyes. We never spoke the dead man's name, but every action in the house seemed to be done in his shadow. Linda still kept the newspaper on the table every morning, even though no one read it. I still turned on the radio at breakfast time and turned it down so low that the music was barely audible. Silence seemed to be our unspoken agreement. A way of life, a kind of polite grief, until I heard the first rumor at the corner coffee shop. A middle-aged man sipped his espresso and said, "A son lives with a stepmother. It sounds wrong." The man next to him laughed. "No one lives like that unless there's something wrong." I was about to turn away, but I stood there for a long time. I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of people wanting everything to fit into a box. Tired of grieving having to have a schedule. That evening, I went home. Linda was arranging flowers, something she rarely did since the funeral. I leaned against the door frame. She didn't turn around, but asked, "Would you like some tea?" I said, "Yes." We drank tea. We didn't talk. But for the first time, I thought maybe we weren't just living together to endure. Maybe we were holding each other back so that we wouldn't drift too far away from life. And that's when I realized we don't need to say we're okay, because we're proving it every day by our quiet existence. There are relationships that don't need a name. All it takes is enough time and enough silence. Linda and I never had an intimate moment in the way people talk about it. No hugs, no shared meals filled with laughter, no afternoons watching TV, leaning on each other. But I don't know when. But I began to realize we were there for each other in a way that even relatives sometimes can't. One morning, I walked into the kitchen. On the table was a small piece of paper written in slanted handwriting. "There are waffles in the box. Remember to bring them if you go to school." I held the paper and stared at it for a long time. Not because of the message, but because of the way she wrote "you" small but clear, as if she had practiced it in her head before putting pen to paper. After that, I started leaving my own little notes. "The coffee maker's jammed. I fixed it. Remember to drink enough water, Mom. The news this morning was jammed. It might be because of the rain." We didn't talk directly, but those little pieces of paper gradually became a private language between two people who were no longer strangers, but didn't dare to get close. Every morning, I saw her standing in front of the kitchen window, drinking tea, looking out into the yard. I didn't know what she was thinking. I didn't ask, but every day I poured boiling water into the thermos before leaving. She never said thank you, but every time I came back, the thermos was washed and put in its proper place. Gradually, we learned how to be present with each other, without hurting each other again. I started cleaning my father's room, not to erase memories, but to make room for something else. The breath of a present that needed to be lived. Linda didn't ask me what I was doing in that room, but I knew she noticed. For the first time in a year, I saw the window open, the curtains pulled back. One evening, while I was folding the blanket, she knocked on the door. She held an old shirt of Dad's. "This, can you keep it? If not, I'll take it away." I took it and folded it. "I'll keep it." She nodded slightly. She said nothing more. We stood there for a while, so quiet that we could hear the heater rattling. From that day on, Linda started cooking again. Not every day, but every time, she always asked me if I wanted to eat in a very natural way. "I boiled some corn today. Can you eat it? Or I'm going to make cream soup. Are you allergic to mushrooms?" I always answered, "Sure." Not because of the food, because I knew the invitation was not simply a question about what to eat. It was, "Are you still willing to stay here with me?" We never sat down to eat for very long, but sometimes I washed the dishes more slowly than usual, just to hear her tell a little story. When I was young, I used to work in a used bookstore. There, the old books smelled very much like wood stoves, the kind of smell that people don't print anymore. I didn't ask why she hadn't told me before. I didn't ask why her voice sometimes trembled slightly at the end of a sentence. I just looked down at the pile of dishes, nodded, and said, "I understand." One day it was raining heavily. I came home late from school. I was wet and cold. As I opened the door, I saw a towel in the living room neatly placed on the back of a chair. On it was a note. "The hot water is on in the bathroom if you want it." I walked past her room. The door was ajar. She was lying down reading a book. She didn't look up, but I knew she knew I was home. I said softly, "Thank you." For the first time, she responded immediately, "You're welcome." That simple sentence to me was like a heartbeat returning after it had stopped. We were still not a family, by definition. No pictures on the wall, no evenings playing chess or going to the supermarket on weekends. But since when we had become a place where each other could quietly return, I began to notice the way she chose her clothes, simple, but with light patterns. The way she walked more slowly, but with a straighter back. The way she called my name more clearly, whenever she needed something. I also started to repair the back porch, just replacing some rotten wood. But that day she brought out 2 cups of tea, placed them beside her, and said, "This place has a beautiful view of the morning sun. I think we should sit here more often." I smiled and said, "I agree." No need to explain. No need to promise. No need to ask each other, "What are we?" Because in a world with so much noise, Sometimes the silent presence is the loudest thing our hearts can feel. In life, there are moments that don't last more than a few seconds, but can completely change the way we see a person. That moment for me happened one night in early spring. At that time, my eyes were sore. Not serious, just seasonal allergies. I remembered that I had an old bottle of eye drops, probably left in the laundry basket. The last time Linda packed the clothes to put in the washing machine, she must have mistakenly put them in her room. The hallway light was still dim. The house was as quiet as every night, only the steady hum of the heater downstairs. I knocked lightly on Linda's door. There was no response. I pushed the door open and entered, intending to just look for the medicine and leave. The desk lamp was still on. There was no one in the room. A folded blanket. The window was closed. Everything was neat. I walked to the small table next to the bed where books or reading glasses were usually placed. As I bent down to look in the drawer, my eyes caught sight of something lying on top. A box of condoms open. Beside it was a fresh, long cucumber resting loosely on a half-read novel. I stood still, touched nothing. The space around me was no longer a familiar room, but a wind wall touching the forbidden. I was not shocked. I was not panicked. I did not speculate. Only one thing was very clear in my mind. Linda was alive, too. She also had desires that she did not share with anyone. We had never talked about her private life. I had never thought that she would have a world of her own behind the door that closed every night. I had always seen Linda as a quiet, patient, polite woman, someone who kept the rhythm of life steady in this house. I forgot that she had been a wife, a woman with all the things that make up life, including the parts that society usually does not allow middle-aged women to possess openly. I quietly stepped back, closed the door as if it had never been opened, went to my room, and told no one I had seen. But that night, I did not sleep. I did not feel disgusted or disappointed, just surprised. Not because of what I saw, but because of the way I had always looked at Linda, perhaps too narrowly. I had always thought of myself as respecting her. But that respect was actually a polite cover in which I confined her to the stereotype of the calm, self-sacrificing, lifeless stepmother. And what I saw that night woke me up from that stereotype. The next morning, everything went on as usual. Linda cooked breakfast. I washed the dishes. We made small talk about the weather and the awning repair. No mention of the night before. Not a word about the eye drops. Not a word about the room. But I knew she knew I had been in there. And I understood that she didn't need an explanation. We chose to keep it where we started in silence. From that day on, I saw Linda differently. Not distant, not awkward, not strange. Just I began to see her as a fuller person, not a stepmother, not as my father's woman, but as a 43-year-old woman, lonely, mature, still ambitious, and as worthy of life as anyone else. When she asked me, "Would you like some more orange juice?" I smiled. "Yes, Mom." For the first time, I called her mother so freely because I knew that the word was no longer forced, but part of mutual acceptance without prejudice, without conditions. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. No need to talk. No need to confront. We agreed to let it go. Not because it was not important, but because there are things that when kept in silence are more respected. I began to think differently about what is called boundary. Not all boundaries should be drawn with words. And not everything that goes beyond society's expectations is wrong. There are feelings that only become dangerous when people try to define them. But if they're left quietly like a stream flowing underground, then it is that silence that helps them last. That night I wrote in my diary, "Sometimes what makes me feel ashamed is not the behavior of others, but the way I thought they had no right to do it." The next day I suggested to Linda, "Let's go somewhere, maybe the beach. A change of pace." She looked at me with a little surprise, but her eyes were softer than usual. "You mean go out?" I smiled. "No need to call names. Let's just go." There were moments that needed no words, no arguments, no one to confirm. They just happened quietly. But afterwards, things were never the same again. After the evening of mistakenly entering Linda's room and discovering something unexpected, I didn't ask, and she didn't mention it either. There was no apology, No scrutinizing glance, just a subtle but heavy silence stretching through every movement as if we both knew. We saw each other on a side that had never been named. The next morning when I went down to the kitchen, Linda was making tea as usual. She put the cup on the table as if nothing had happened. Not a single evasive look, not a hint of reluctance, but I knew something had changed. We ate breakfast in silence. Not an awkward silence, but a silence as if we were walking on very thin ice. If we spoke, everything would break. Linda didn't ask why I went to her room last night. I didn't explain either. We accepted the existence of a moment without having to name it. That afternoon, when I washed the car in the yard, Linda came out with a glass of ice water. She handed it to me, then said, "It's starting to get hot." I nodded. Yes, it'll probably rain in a few days. We were both silent, standing next to each other. Just a few casual words, but I felt it clearly in the way she stood. I know you saw, but I also know you don't judge. That evening, as I was about to close my door, I heard footsteps. Linda walked across the hallway, paused for a moment, said nothing, then continued walking. The soft click of heels hitting the wooden floor just loud enough for me to understand. We're still here, still under the same roof. For the next week, no one touched on that sensitive topic, but the atmosphere had calmed down. We still did chores, still shared grocery schedules, still reminded each other to watch the plumbing downstairs. I noticed that Linda had started to choose clothes a little differently, not too bright, but with a little accent. One day, she wore an old perfume that my father had given her. I didn't ask why, but I understood she was returning to being herself, a woman with her own life, a world that didn't necessarily have to be confined to the role of stepmother. One evening, while we were folding laundry in the living room, I accidentally dropped a towel. Linda leaned down with me, our hands touching, but neither of us pulled back. No surprise, no words. We just looked at each other for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for not asking anything." I replied, "Because I thought you didn't need to answer." The moment wasn't long, but it was enough for both of us to understand. We've gone through a blur while still maintaining respect for each other. The next day, she left a note on the table. "Freshly brewed ginger tea if you need it." I folded the note and put it in my pocket. Not because I needed the tea, but because I needed to know Mom still wanted to take care of me in her own way. And I responded by quietly repairing Dad's old photo frame, installing a new piece of glass. I didn't hang it up again, but left it in a drawer along with the handwritten letter she had written to Dad years ago. I knew she would see it, and I want her to know. I don't forget, but I also don't keep you there. We didn't solve anything. But by not saying anything, by not retreating, we chose to forgive each other in silence. Not because we were at fault, but because we both understood sometimes to keep something pure, we don't need to explain. Just don't tear it apart. Linda returned to being Linda, a little more cautious, but not withdrawn. I also stopped avoiding eye contact. We both returned to a new normal where silence was no longer a barrier, but a soft bridge. The sea breeze was unlike any wind on land. It smelled of salt, the sound of waves, and something hard to describe, like forgiveness from nature. We arrived at the beach late one afternoon. Linda didn't have much luggage. Just a few simple clothes, a book, a bottle of sunscreen, and a pair of worn flip-flops. The small cottage was right next to the ocean, not fancy but quiet. We didn't say much as we packed. But we both knew this trip wasn't just for a change of pace. That evening, we had dinner on the wooden porch. Yellow lights hung on strings. Waves lapped steadily beneath our feet. After dinner, Linda took a thin blanket and invited me to the sand. The moon rose. The waves were white. The sand was cool under our bare feet. We sat just the right distance apart. Not too far, not too close. Linda said softly, "It's been a long time since I heard the ocean at night." I asked, "When was the last time you heard it?" She was silent for a moment, then answered, "The last time I went with your father." The wind blew through my shoulders. I clasped my hands together, my eyes looking toward the horizon. I knew I had to say it, not to free her, but because I wanted her to live. I took a deep breath, then said softly, "Mom, You don't have to keep yourself in the same role forever. Linda turned, looked at me without blinking. I continued. I'm a grown man. I can take care of myself. You don't need to live just to provide for my stability. I don't want you to sacrifice anymore for me. The wind grew stronger. A corner of the blanket flew up, then landed back on the sand. Linda still looked at me. Her eyes weren't full of tears, but they were unusually bright. What are you talking about, Nathan? I looked at her, my voice firm. I want you to live up to your age, with what's left of you. You're still beautiful. You're still healthy. You deserve a partner. Someone to love. Someone to keep going if you want to. Linda turned away. She didn't answer right away. There was only the sound of waves, one wave after another, each one steady, like the ocean's long sigh. I didn't press. I didn't say more. After a while, she let out a soft sigh. There's a part of me that died with your father. That part all these years I thought would never come back to life. I nodded slowly. I understand. But the rest is still alive, and I don't need anyone's permission to continue. We sat in silence for a long time. No one looked at each other, but no one felt the need to leave. The wind began to get cold. Linda pulled the blanket over her shoulders. She asked, if I really start over, would you be angry? I smiled slightly. No, I would be proud because I know it's not easy for someone to dare to live again after having lost something. Linda looked straight at the sea. She didn't say anything more, but I felt her hand move a little closer to mine. We didn't need a hug. We didn't need dramatic emotions, just an agreement that from tomorrow, everything could start over without having to step over the person who died or deny old feelings. That night, before going to bed, Linda opened my door, left it ajar like always, and said softly, "Thank you for seeing me as a real person." I replied, "You've always been real. It's just now I'm old enough to see that." The trip lasted 3 days. There was no dramatic turning point, no moment of breaking out. Just two people who had been hurt, who had kept quiet now, allowing each other to live on without guilt, without burdens. The trip ended after 3 days of light sunshine, high moonlit nights, and a few quiet conversations. Nothing special. It didn't need to be special. Just a moment of silence for two souls who had been scratched to find their breath again. When we returned, the small house where we had lived for many seasons was still the same. Still the creaking wooden porch, still the smell of old wood, and the wind blowing through the west window. But we were no longer the same. No one said it. But in every gesture, every distance between steps, Linda and I both knew. The time we spent together has reached its most beautiful limit. I no longer walked downstairs every morning as if I were a permanent part of this place. I walked more slowly, observed more closely, and inside something had sprouted. Not sadness, but readiness. One morning, as I fixed the kitchen cabinet doors, something I did often, Linda stood behind me holding a cup of tea and said softly, "Are you thinking about going back to school?" I paused. Turn around. Nod. "I'm thinking about taking a course this fall." She didn't ask any more questions, just smiled. It said, "I know and I support you." We didn't discuss moving out or moving out. No paper was printed. No suitcase was left in the middle of the room, but each of us began to withdraw a little. I wasn't home for dinner every night. I went to the coffee shop occasionally or walked farther than usual. Linda no longer left my clothes in the laundry basket with hers. She folded them separately and placed them neatly by my door. No note. That evening, as I was folding shirts, I remembered Linda hadn't called me her father's son in a long time. Now I was just Nathan, a young man who had been hurt, who had relied on her, and who was on his way. One afternoon, Linda placed an envelope on the kitchen table. "There's some money your father left. I don't need it. I thought you should have it." I picked it up silent. No refusal. No thanks. Just looked at her for a long time and knew. You've chosen to step down as breadwinner. You're giving back freedom without the burdens. That night, I packed up a few personal items. Just what was absolutely necessary. A book, a laptop, a diary, a few clothes, and a small framed photo of the three of us. Dad, me, and Linda. I didn't say I'm leaving. Linda didn't ask, "When are you leaving?" We let it happen as if it had been agreed upon without words. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, I left the house. No door closing, no tears. Just a small note I left on the kitchen table next to the still warm teapot. Thank you, Mom, for not keeping me and for teaching me how to hold on to myself. 3 days later, Linda called a repairman to repair the porch. A week later, she planted lavender on the fence. A month later, I received a package in the mail. My favorite scarf, freshly washed and folded. No letter, just a dried petal pressed in newspaper. Neither of us broke up. But a chapter had closed, and that closure was strangely pure. That silent farewell was not the end, but the beginning of a resurrection for Linda, a woman who began to step out of the role of housekeeper to live for herself. For me, a son who once lived in the safe zone of loss, now learning to stand up for himself. We no longer live under the same roof, but in a sense, we are still together through each quiet maturity. 3 years passed so quickly that sometimes it seemed like a dream. I had graduated, lived in a town about 5 hours away from my old house, had a stable job, a few social connections, and sometimes a vague nostalgia. One morning in June, as the wind began to carry the scent of new sunshine, I received a simple text message from my old neighbor. Linda still tends the lavender garden the same way, but now she has someone to help her water the plants every afternoon. I didn't ask any more questions. I just made an appointment, and the next morning I was on my way. The road leading to the old house was the same, winding, lined with oak trees and the sound of cicadas in the wind. I stopped in front of the gate. The house didn't look much different, but there was something that I immediately recognized. It was alive, no longer a place to endure. Before I could ring the bell, the gate opened softly. Linda stepped out. Her hair was cut shorter. Her clothes were neat, still simple, but somehow brighter than before. Her eyes met mine as if 3 years had never passed. No over-emotion, no tears, just a smile. "Nathan, I came to see Mom. Would you like some tea?" We sat on the porch as we had 100 times before. A pot of chamomile tea, a thin slice of lemon, and 2 old china cups. Linda told a few small stories about the newly planted rose bush, the stray cat that came through the yard, and a group of friends who read books every Tuesday. I didn't say much. I just listened and saw that she was really living, not trying to live. After a while, I asked, "Are you okay?" She looked out into the yard where a middle-aged man was bending over to water a lavender bush. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm living the life I want." I didn't ask who it was. No need to. I just saw him turn around, smile briefly at Linda, and nod to me from afar. I nodded back. We didn't say anything. Didn't introduce ourselves. Didn't explain. But it was all clear. Part of me choked up a little, not because I was sad but because happy. I'd been hoping for this since 3 years ago on the beach. And now it was happening without drama, without fuss. Linda looked at me and said softly, "You were right, Nathan. I don't have to live the rest of my life in silence." I placed my hands around my teacup, smiling. "I know you can." We didn't need to say anything more. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything was enough. We used to need each other to survive, then quietly let go of each other to continue living. And now we can meet again without pain, without guilt, without confusion. That afternoon, I went to the back garden. The lavender row Linda had planted now covered almost the small path. There were butterflies. There were bees. There was the smell of sunshine. I stood still, took a deep breath, and for the first time in many years, I no longer saw my father's figure somewhere around the house. Not because I had forgotten him, but because I had accepted that life is not about staying in memory, but knowing how to move forward with gratitude. When I left, I did not say a long goodbye. Linda saw me to the gate. I held her hand for a moment, then let go. She said, "You'll always have a place here, but I know you have your own path." I nodded. Me too. The car pulled away from the path, the afternoon light shining through the windshield, reflecting an image behind me. A middle-aged woman standing by a wooden gate, waving her hand gently behind her. A man watering flowers, and a house, finally coming back to life. Life is not a straight line. It curves, turns, sometimes seems lost, then silently brings us back to where we need to go. 3 years ago, in a small house in the suburbs of America, there were two people who survived loss. They were not related by blood. They were not the same age, but they stayed together when the only person who had connected them had gone forever. Linda, the stepmother with no clear title. Nathan, the stepson who is past his teenage years. They lived together like two shadows nestled together to block the sun. No one thought they needed each other so much. No one understood why they didn't leave. Society gossiped. Rumors flew like the wind through the fence. But in that house, the two people still silently shared breakfast, cleaned the garden, and endured the void that no one else could fill. Then one day, the unexpected happened. Not a fight, not a broken ending, but a small moment that revealed a part of the other that had never been seen. And instead of accusing or running away, they chose the noblest option: silence and respect. The subsequent sea voyage was not an escape, but a sigh. A way of saying, "We've held each other long enough. Now let's let each other go." No goodbyes, no painful scenes, just one person packing up, one person folding a towel, and both letting the bond fall away. Linda lived on in a real way. She didn't age. She became a woman again, not someone's stepmother, not the ex-wife from the past. Nathan left not because of tiredness, but because of having enough. He received from Linda not only a place to stay, but the greatest lesson: how to love someone without binding them, how to let go without abandoning. 3 years later, when they met again, they didn't need to say much. The look was enough. A new life was existing behind the wooden gate. Flowers were watered, people were loved, and the past preserved as part of maturity, not an unhealed wound. Life doesn't end when people break up. It just changes roles. From the one who sticks around to the one who observes. From the one who stays to the one who blesses. And sometimes just knowing when to step away, you have saved the most sacred thing from being hurt. This is not a love story. It is not a tragedy either, but it is a transition. From loss to rebirth, from dependence to independence, from role to true self. Nathan once needed Linda as a support, and it was he who helped Linda remember that she could still live a meaningful life, not just exist for the past. We don't always choose who we live with after loss, but we can choose how we live. And sometimes just a long enough look, a timely request, an unbroken silence. We have given each other a chance to be reborn without sacrificing each other to achieve it. Because the deepest feeling is not possessive love, but the love of people who know how to leave at the right time. You don't need to stay to be called family. You just need to help someone live up to the part they once lost. That's enough. In a world of relationships filled with boundaries and prejudice, Linda and Nathan's story is a reminder that understanding, even silently, can heal. And letting go when it's time is a blessing. If you're at an age that people often call late, remember this. Rebirth can begin after 40, 50, even 70. All you have to do is allow yourself to live on as yourself. Thank you for listening to the story. The story is not loud, not climactic, but it's enough to show us that every life deserves a gentle ending. And if possible, be the one to help others find that ending. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. Perhaps in your life there's been someone who has taught you how to love without holding on, how to let go without losing. If so, please share that story in the comment section. Who knows, your story might be what someone needs to hear. Don't forget to follow so you don't miss any heart-touching stories. See you again on the next journey, where we go through things we thought were old to see that life is about being able to start over, no matter how old you are. See you again in the next story, team.